Welcome to Abundant EM. We are glad you are here. Today is God's miraculous presence out of Exodus 17. Can we all stand? It is 4 slides that we will be reading together. So we're going to read them all together. So Exodus 17, verses 1 to 7, verse 1 and 2 here together. Ready? Begin. At the Lord's command, the whole community of Israel left and moved from place to place. Eventually they camped at Rephidim, but there was no water there for the people to drink. So once more the people complained against Moses. "Give us water to drink," they demanded. "Quiet," Moses replied. "Why are you complaining against me, and why are you testing the Lord?" But tormented by thirst, they continued to argue with Moses. "Why did you bring us out of Egypt? Are you trying to kill us, our children, and our livestock with thirst?" Then Moses cried out to the Lord, "What should I do with these people? They are ready to stone me." The Lord said to Moses, "Walk out in front of the people. Take your staff, the one you used when you struck the water of the Nile, and call some of the elders of Israel to join you. I will stand before you on the rock at Mount Sinai. Strike the rock, and water will come gushing out. Then the people will be able to drink." So Moses struck the rock as he was told, and water gushed out as the elders looked on. Last one. Moses named the place Massa, which means test, and Meribah, which means arguing, because the people of Israel argued with Moses and tested the Lord by saying, "Is the Lord here with us or not?" This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. So last week I asked a question, which one is harder, hunger or thirst? And most of you said, what? Thirst. Apparently thirst is harder. That probably is true. I would be like, I'll just eat some watermelon. So then that kind of like covers hunger and thirst. But all of you said thirst was harder to be patient about than hunger. So that's interesting because today we're talking about thirst. We are in our series right now, Law and Life, moving through the books of Exodus through Deuteronomy. And last week we saw God's miraculous provision, that there was actually bread from heaven that God rained down every single day for 2 million people for 40 years. But it was actually less about the manna, it was less about the bread, and it was actually more about the lesson of trust. Would the Israelites trust God when they're in need? Remember, there are 3 tests. This is the context. The first one was just 3 days after the Red Sea parted and they were miraculously delivered. And 3 days later, they came to a place with water that was bitter. They could not drink it. And so they complained against God. And God made the water clean and gave them water and said, "This will be the test. This will be the way for me to test you and see, will you trust me?" Because it's less about the water and less about the bread. And it's actually about the question, do you trust me? First test, water. Second test was last week with food. And when they complained, we saw that God graciously responded by raining bread from heaven. This week is the third test. Here we have again about thirst. Exodus 17, verse 1 and 2. It says here they're thirsty. Who did they initially complain against? Moses. That's who they complained against. But notice in this passage that Moses says, "Why are you complaining against me? Why are you testing the Lord?" So here's the thing that we realize. The first point is this. When we complain, that is actually putting God to the test. Now, hear me out. Listen to the whole thing, okay? This should feel like deja vu to the Israelites because they've literally been in this situation already, okay? There's no water. They're upset. They should have been like, whoa, deja vu. This feels familiar. God told us then that this would be the test. So do they just have like short-term memory? Like, how come they don't remember this? In other words, when the Israelites are complaining, what they're actually saying is they're like auditory saying, "We're thirsty." But what they're really saying below the surface of what they're actually saying out loud is that we will not trust you, God, unless you prove yourself trustworthy over and over and over again. In other words, their complaints show the deeper root heart issue. Okay, you guys all know. So I do a lot of counseling work, and a lot of work boils down in counseling to some kind of trauma or abandonment or some kind of issue when someone's young. Not always, but often that's what it boils down to. So when someone has trauma history or when someone has abandonment issues, right, from a friend, a partner, a parent, when they have those kinds of issues, no matter what anyone says or does, no matter what a good friend will do to always stay with that person or their spouse or whatever, no matter what they do to that person who has those abandonment issues, what they're asking is, I don't trust you until you prove me over and over and over and over and over again. It's never good enough for that person because they're actually looking at the world through their hurt and through their pain. The Israelites, in a nutshell, are 2 million people with trust issues. That's what it basically is. The Israelites acted as though any obstacle, any issue, we don't have water, oh my gosh. We don't have food, oh my gosh. They treated every single thing as proof that God would abandon them unless he proved differently. So do you hear that? They're first assuming that God will leave them. That's their first assumption. They look at the world through the lens of, he's not good enough. God's not good enough. Versus their first lens being, God is with me. Does that make sense? It's kind of like the whole, are you seeing the glass half empty or the glass half full? It's kind of the same idea. We're looking at the same glass. But what perspective you have changes the conclusion that you draw from that same experience. So these Israelites are looking at God and they're like, you know what? See? We're thirsty again. Look, he did it once, but he's not going to be faithful. He's abandoned us again. We're going to die of thirst again. So what if he opened the sea? He won't do it again. Versus Moses being like, hold on. No. God has been faithful. He will continue to be faithful. So let me ask all of us this question. Because all of us, on our worst of days, we have complaints. But complaints are actually a really good window into what we actually think and how we actually view God. So it starts with, what is the content of your complaint? All of us. When we complain, and some of us are really good at saying that out loud. Others would never complain out loud. In fact, we judge people who complain out loud. But inside, we have our own complaints too. So what is the content of your usual complaint against God? And what does that reveal about the way you view God? What does that reveal? Because even our complaints are a way for us to get a better picture of how we view God. So verse 3, they're tormented by thirst. So when they're tormented by thirst, they cannot hear anything. Does it make sense? Like, they don't hear anything. If you're hungry or you're tired or you're thirsty, nothing goes through your brain, right? Sometimes I have clients that come to me like, oh my gosh, I'm feeling the worst, And then I'm like, okay, did you sleep? They're like, no, man, like 2 hours. For how long? The last 10 years. Okay. Did you eat today? Like, no, man, I only had chocolate. I'm like, Did you drink your water? Like, no, I just drank a bunch of caffeine. Great. I think I know what your issues are. Okay. Your basic issues, if you have those things in place, you can't see clearly. For these people, same thing. They're tormented by thirst. Reason makes no sense to them. They're like, dude, why did you bring us here? Are you trying to kill us? Our children and our livestock. To the point where they must have gotten imagine this giant mob of 2 million people thirsty. They probably were actually going to stone Moses. That's why he's scared for his own life. God is like, step in. So here's the thing. Notice here that Moses cries out to the Lord. The people cry out to Moses. Okay, notice that difference. Because here's the thing. Complaining actually keeps us from experiencing God's presence. So for Moses, God was right there with him because he's talking to God. He's crying out to God. What am I supposed to do? For the Israelites, God was in their mind. God was not there with them. Does that make sense? They did not go to God with their complaint. They went to Moses. For the Israelites, their doubt kept them from experiencing God's presence, even though for Moses, God was right there with him. Do you see that? For Moses, God was right there. There's a talking relationship, right? For the Israelites, they could not see God. They could not experience him, even though he was right there with Moses. So here's the thing. It's not actually about water, right? It's not actually about thirst. So most of the time, our complaints aren't actually about, I don't have enough money or whatever it may be. The deeper issue is our heart. What do they actually believe about God? Could they depend on him? Could they trust him? So let me ask you, what is the deeper issue underneath your and my complaint? Our usual complaint. Do you believe that God is with you? Or does your focus keep you from experiencing God's presence? Because God is here. But the wrong perspective and that mindset actually keeps us from experiencing God's presence. So does that mean God only wants to talk to you when you have only good things to talk about? That's not true, right? There's a difference between complaining about someone versus talking to someone, right? So the Israelites complained about God to Moses versus Moses actually brought his worries to God. There's a big difference between those two things. In 1 Peter 5:7, there's this famous verse, give all your worries and cares to God, for he cares about you. There's this children's song from a long time ago, okay? It goes, you know the little kids Sunday school songs? It goes, cast your burden, cast your burden unto Jesus, for he cares for you. That's how the song goes, okay? And the whole point of that song is you can have worries. God is not saying don't have worries. He is saying don't be anxious. But he knows we're going to have worries about this life. That's how we're built, okay? But there's a difference between worrying and complaining about God and taking our complaints and worries to God. There's a big difference. Okay, for example, I'm really mad at Sam, okay? Because he's so annoying, all right? So I go to Jackson, and I'm like, Jackson, Sam is such a bad friend. Do you know what he did? Do you know what he said? He's a punk, okay? So I am complaining about Sam to Jackson, right? So not only am I complaining, but I'm also gossiping at this point now, okay? But what if I went to Sam and I was like, Sam, we need to talk, okay? Sam's like, sure, what's up? I'm like, dude, we have beef. We got to work this out because I do not like you right now, okay? But I also know that's partially my issue, but we got to work this out. That's a totally different response. Does it make sense, right? In one, I'm complaining about someone and actually causing more problems and actually creating greater division and greater rift. And the other, I'm actually going to him for the sake of relationship. Does that make sense? I care more about the relationship, so I'm going to be willing to confront and change the things that are causing a rift in our relationship. Does that make sense? Two very different things. If the Israelites had come to God and been like, God, we know you've tested us. We know we're supposed to trust you, but it's really hard. We're really thirsty. Please do something. Very different response than what they actually did, which was complaining to Moses, where is this water? In essence, they're saying, why would you bring us out? Because they know who told Moses to lead them out? God. They're saying, why would you lead us out? Just for us to die again. Same thing. It's like me going to Jackson to complain about Sam instead of me going directly to Sam. Very, very big difference. The complaints and how we complain about it, that really shows us a lot about our heart. So, if you could shift your complaining about God to actually talking to God, what would you say? How would that change the relationship? Does that make sense? He's not saying don't have worries, don't have complaints. He's saying be mindful of how you complain and who you complain to, because that actually reveals a lot more about your heart. And when you complain poorly, because we all do that, that's okay, but be aware of it. and realize what you're doing. And instead of complaining about God, we go to God with those things. If you were God, and this was the third time, okay, literally every morning you rain down food from heaven. Just that morning, this exact day when they complained about no water, that morning they went out to gather bread. Because this happens after the manna incident, right? So they just went out that morning to get bread. And now here they are a few hours later complaining about no water when they've already experienced the first time how God gave them water. If you were God, how would you respond to these people who are going to stone your leader that you put in place to guide them? Verse 5. Look at his response. The Lord said to Moses, walk out so that everyone can see you. Take your staff, the very same one you used to struck the Nile that turned it to blood for that very first plague. That same staff you struck the Red Sea with to split the sea into dry ground, okay? That very same staff. Not because the staff is magical, but because I work through it. So it's a symbol for them to realize and remember who is working through you. And call the elders, have them join you. Let them actually physically witness and see what I'm about to do. Because I will stand before you on the rock at Mount Sinai. Strike the rock and water will come gushing out. Then the people will be able to drink. So Moses struck the rock as he was told, and water gushed out as the elders looked on. God always provides. But more than provision is God's presence. More important than the provision is God's presence. Do you hear me? Because God will always provide for each of us. But what's more important than the actual water, the actual bread, is that God's presence is there. Think about, back in the day, they always talk about, especially so my husband grew up in Korea, right? And especially during the, my husband's generation, millennials, a lot of the time, those kids were left alone. They would go to school all day, come home, go to Hagwon. Parents were not very involved because both parents worked a lot of the time. So my husband has this really sad story about when he was a kid and he came home and there's no food. And so he was trying to make 참치밥. And he opened the tuna can and he cut his finger really bad. And he still has a scar. But nobody was home, so he didn't know what to do. But a lot of the times they talk about parents work so hard so their kids can do sports and do music and get the latest game console or whatever. Parents do all this work, right? To give their kids all the things they want. But what do kids actually want? No. Kids don't want money. And at the end of the day, what the kids actually want is their parents' presence, is to be with them, to spend time with them. They're like, I don't care about, thanks for the game console and it's nice for a few days. But what do I actually care about? What do I actually need is my parents' presence, right? Except for Sam. Sam needs to do so. I'm just kidding. Okay, but the point being this, God gives most important his presence. And his response is so kind and so tender. If this was you, if this was me, I'd be like, you guys, man, do not deserve it. You did not get the lesson. And yet, he said, I will not only provide for you, but I will be with you. I will be with you. So how do you expect God to respond to your complaints usually? Versus, how do you think God in his character actually wants to respond to you? What do you think God would say in response to you? God is often more tender and kind than we ever deserve, even in our complaints, even in our weaknesses. The more we know this, the more we'll go to him. He is not like our earthly fathers who respond often out of anger or frustration. He is God. Verse 7. So Moses named the place Massa, which means test, and Meribah, which means arguing. Because the people of Israel argued with Moses and tested the Lord by saying, is the Lord here with us or not? See, that was the actual question. When they said, where is the water? The actual question they were saying is If God was really with us, there'd be water. But there's no water. So he must have left us to die. See how their response was? So their complaint wasn't actually about water. It was actually about accusing God of not being there with them. But in their accusation, in their complaints, they could not see that God was with them, whereas Moses could see that God was with him. When we complain, internally or externally, because we all do it, it is a really good thermometer for us. It's a really good way for us to gauge, because we all have fear and anxiety. That's normal as human beings. But what we do with that, how we look at God through that, are we complaining about God, or are we coming to him with our cares, with our worries, with our concerns? Because here's our main point. Our complaints do reveal our doubts. That's what it does. But God is always faithful to be with us. Always. But it's your choice and my choice. Do we come to him with our complaints, or do we just complain about him? It's a big, big difference. So actually today, I was inspired by a certain young man in our EM who is very motivated right now to be writing down everything in his journal, okay? So take out your journals if you have a physical one, okay? Otherwise, promise to me you're going to only open the Notes app on your phone, okay? So open up your phones. We have not done this in a while. And go to the next slide on front and back, okay? I got 4 questions for you, okay? This is not to share with anybody else. No one's going to ask you these questions, the answers to these questions, okay? But I want you to actually open up your phone. Open up your phones. Open it up, okay? Open the Notes app. Whatever app you use to take notes, okay? And I want you to create a new note and title it January, what's today, you guys? 19th, right? 2025. And if you're smart, like Sam, you're taking a picture of this slide so you can respond also in the app, okay? Great. And I'm going to turn on some music, and I'm going to give us a good 10 minutes, okay? Because I want you to actually ask yourself these questions. You will not grow past your complaints unless you learn to self-reflect and to be aware and to use this to bring you closer to God. Okay? So here are your questions. Here's the first. What is the content of your usual complaints? Maybe you have none right now. So what do you usually complain about? Or maybe you actually do have one right now. Okay? I want you to actually do this, all right? What does that show you about the way you view God? Question 2, what is the deeper issue beneath your complaint? Do you believe that God is with you, or does your focus on your complaint keep you from experiencing God's presence? It's also behind you as well. If you could shift your complaining about God to talking to God, what would you say? And how do you expect God to respond versus how will he actually respond? Right? So right now, write it down. And I want you to actually write down your answers. Jot down some notes and thoughts.